One useful way to organize our understanding of reality is to think in terms of things that are either very big, like stars and black holes, very small, like molecules, atoms, and subatomic particles, or very complex, aggregates of many particles that are highly ordered or structured. Tonight, we're going to focus on one of these three categories, the complex, the human brain. Now, it is not uncommon to hear the brain described as the most complex structure in the entire universe. But as we have such a meager knowledge of what might be out there, I, for one, am not ready to make that commitment, and there's no need to. The brain is complex, and its functions not just wondrous, but the very substrate of who we are as individuals and as a species. So the pull to understand the brain is strong. This program is called Decoding the Brain because the work of all the scientists we'll be speaking with in one way or another is contributing to a deeper understanding of the cascading electrical processes crackling through our brains, which somehow result in our experiences, our emotions, and our behaviors. In short, we will explore various ways that new tools that allow us to directly probe brain processes are helping to reveal that most complex of objects here on Earth, the human brain. Our first guest is Michael Halassa, who is the class of 1958 career development professor at MIT's Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences, and is also an associate investigator at MIT's McGovern Institute for Brain Research. His aim is to understand the basic architecture and the functional connections in the brain that underlie cognition, and he has identified basic circuit mechanisms for attention and decision-making. He joins us from his home outside of Boston. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Brian. Great to be here.
Our next guest is Edward Chang, who is the Joan and Sanford Weill Chairman of the Department of Neurological Surgery at the University of California, San Francisco. He co-directs the Center for Neural Engineering and Prostheses, which brings together engineers and neuroscientists to develop technology that can restore function to patients with neurological disabilities. He joins us from San Francisco. Welcome, Eddie.
Hi, Brian.
Our next guest is Michael Cahanna, who is the Edmund J. and Louise W. Kahn Term Professor of Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he is the principal investigator at the university's Computational Memory Lab. He studies human episodic memory and is currently working on building a prosthetic device to enhance it. He joins us from his office in Philadelphia.
Thank you, Brian.
Welcome, Michael.
Happy to be here.
Our next guest is Helen Mayberg, who is the director of the Center of Advanced Circuit Therapeutics and a professor of neuroscience, neurology, neurosurgery, and psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. She has done pioneering work to uncover the neural circuitry of depression and to treat it via deep brain stimulation. She joins us from her office in New York. Welcome, Helen.
Nice to be here, Brian.
Finally, we have György Buzsáki, who is the Biggs Professor of Neuroscience at New York University of Medicine. He is the author of The Brain from Inside Out, in which he proposes a new paradigm for the study of the brain, and he is currently decoding the underlying patterns by which the brain operates. He joins us from his office in New York. Welcome, György.
Thank you, Brian.
So thank you all for joining us. And let me start with a basic question that's really to the group. I'd love to hear all of you chime in if you have a perspective on it, which is this. Do any of you have a preferred metaphor for thinking about the working of the mind? And what do you think about the computer metaphor? Is it a reasonable way of thinking about the brain for some purposes, or is it a metaphor that should be retired? So maybe we'll begin with Eddie Chang.
You know, from where I stand, it's actually very hard for me to think about the brain like a computer, because when I go to the operating room and see it every week, it doesn't look anything like a computer. Its substrate is fundamentally different, but we use the analogy all the time. And so in our work, it is helpful to frame some questions in terms of the information processing, of the mind in the framework of a computer. But there's so much more that goes on that is generated from the internal model that's inside the mind, in the substrate of the brain, that is far beyond what modern computers do right now. In fact, I think the analogy for computers in the future might be more like the mind as opposed to the other way around.
Michael Halassa?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian, and I sort of echo what Eddie already mentioned. I should say that one of the things that I think about quite a lot is the idea of scales in the brain, and this multi-scale organization and the vertical integration across these scales. And I think some of these scales, computer science can be extremely valuable in providing the language to describe them. I think what we're potentially lacking is vertically integrated theory to connect all of these scales in a way that would be helpful to connect them to real-world applications. So while the metaphor may work for certain scales at certain times, I think we're just missing a unifying theory for neuroscience to make sense of all of these ideas.
Sure. Helen, thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's interesting because as a neurologist studying a psychiatric disorder like depression, one wanted to start with modules and to think about modular organization. But I think, like Michael says, thinking at different scales is really critical. And I think maybe the one metaphor of depression to this conversation is the nature of it feels like a black hole as kind of an attractor state. And as soon as you enter that metaphor into the conversation, the idea of a computer kind of quantifying that or giving us an organizational structure becomes a little tougher. So I'm really interested in how György answers this question.
Well, that's a good lead-in, György.
Metaphors are useful, and we don't have anything else. The way how the brain works is it always compares. We know the unknown with the help of the known. So we always ground something that we don't understand with the help of something we think we do, such as a computer. And this is a useful metaphor, but we have a lot of other things that are blocking this. And the reason why we are thinking this way is because is the computer world that took the initiative and says, oh, this is like the brain. And the reason why the computers and computer scientists think like about the brain is because they took the wrong brain model. And the wrong brain model is that the brain is a passive device, just like a computer, into which you shovel information, and the computer has no choice. The human mind doesn't have the choice. This is what's called the tabula rasa, or the blank slate model. And this is not by chance, that one of the giants of AI and computer scientist, Alan Turing, explicitly said that the brain, the newborn brain, is like a white paper onto which we have to prescribe things, and this is where we fill it up. Now, just by saying that, the real problem here is that if you follow this recipe from the brain, the AI, then the complexity of the human brain, of any brain, or the AI system depends on the amount of information you put in. And I can tell you later why I think it doesn't. So that's a fundamental difference. The brain is a self-organized system, whereas the computer is a man-made machine.
Right. Yeah, so we will have a time to discuss that in more detail a bit later on. But Michael Cahanna, thoughts on the metaphors of choice for thinking about thinking?
Yeah, so those are all great points. And I love György's point about a self-organizing system. The metaphor that got me interested in memory was from condensed matter theory, spin glass systems, or complex thermodynamic systems where a system could be in multiple states. I mean, a simple example would be water. It could be solid, liquid, or gas, but even more complex systems exist in nature. And so that metaphor I found very appealing as a way of thinking about the brain differently from the computer analogy and in line with the idea of a self-organizing system that György mentioned.
With that as a preamble, let's jump in to some of the astounding, really remarkable work that you all have been pioneering. Eddie, I'm going to start with you. Your focus, at least for some time, has been on understanding the neural circuitry of speech, with, I gather, one of the goals being to be able to have some sensors that can have some understanding of the electrical and other properties that are happening in the brain, and from those signals be able to get some understanding of what the patient is trying to say. So can you give us a sense of what your approach has been and what you have found?
Sure. So our approach has been to understand the neural code for our ability to articulate words and speak. And what I mean by that is the patterning of electrical activity that's generated by the brain activity in the temporal lobe and in the motor cortex that's above it. It's that very precise coordination of neural activity that gives rise to words and sentences. And so for the past decade, we've worked with patients of ours in San Francisco at the University of California, San Francisco, who have volunteered as part of medical treatments that they've had for treatment of their seizures, when implanted electrodes were placed directly on the brain surface with very, very small sensors, maybe the ones you're referring to record that electrical activity at the order of millimeters and milliseconds. And with those kind of recordings, we've been able to decipher and correlate those electrical brain patterns with individual consonants and vowels, as well as syllables, in order to give rise to words.
So if I was one of those patients, you would ask me to imagine saying words, and you'd monitor what goes on inside my head when I'm doing that?
Yeah, a lot of what we focused on actually was not so much about imagining speaking, but the actual production of words. So what I mean by that is when I'm speaking these words right now, how does the neural activity at one particular spot, about a millimeter wide, control the movements of my tongue in a very particular trajectory to create a duh sound, or the site that's right next to it that it controls my lips when we make the sound ba. So there's a map that controls basically all of the very precise movements of the vocal tract. And we study that when people are speaking normally, but also in other conditions, for example, when they are imagining or sometimes even speaking different languages.
And is it important that you're getting the patient to actually say the words, the physical act of speech, as opposed to the mental act of imagining a word? Do those give radically different signals if you try to measure them?
Yeah, great question. We've looked at that pretty carefully, and it turns out that imagining speaking is very, very different than actually speaking. So the act of speaking is a fully intentional and volitional event, whereas when you're just thinking about a thought or even imagining the words, it's a different neural activity pattern that's much more subtle and complex, and that we have a lot more work to figure out how that works. But the actual production of words has become much more clear over the last 5 years.
And is it fairly consistent across distinct patients? If everybody intends to articulate cat or ka, the same signal by and large is generated?
Yeah, that's right. So everyone has a little bit of variability in the absolute position of where these locations are in the brain, but they are confined to the sensory and motor cortex of the part of the brain that controls the parts of our vocal tract. And when you look at the precise position of all of those neurons, it can be highly variable from one individual to another. But when you look at the patterns at a higher order, they're actually really remarkably similar.
And so do you have kind of like a dictionary or a map?
Yeah, both. Basically, it's a map of the different articulators of the vocal tract and the target sounds that we try to speak when we articulate words. And we call it a dictionary because, for example, in English, there's only about 40 phonemes, different speech sounds that give rise to every possible syllable and word. So a dictionary is a very useful way of thinking about it, is that you've got this elemental set of units that by themselves have no meaning, but in combination can give rise to every possible meaning.
So you basically just go through that exhaustive or fairly exhaustive list of elementary building blocks, map those out, and then you can stick them together, I gather, in your dictionary to generate more or less anything that somebody would say.
Yeah, exactly. And when you say exhaustive, something that's very important to think about that is just in the couple of minutes that we've already spoken, we've gone through most of that dictionary, not just once, but a couple of times. So just by simple conversation, just by simple speaking through random sentences even, you can sample all of this. And what's really incredible about it is that as people generate new sentences, we're resampling from that core dictionary, that core set of units, and recombining of ways to give rise to completely new meanings in sentences.
And then I presume then you can test this on new subjects and determine how well your system does at decoding the signatures in the brain that are being read through the implants.
Yeah, that's right. So we can essentially take that code and in the same person or in a different person with some modifications of that code, essentially translate that brain activity for a completely new sentence and reconstruct just from the brain activity alone what someone wanted to say or actually said.
And how well do you do?
I think we're starting to get to the point where things are starting to sound intelligible. So for example, if you wanted to translate brain activity into words and sentences that you actually hear with your ears using speech synthesis, using a machine algorithm to translate the brain activity to actual sounds that you hear through speech synthesis, we're starting to get to the point where it's intelligible, which for us is a really important milestone. There's a lot of room for improvement, but where we are right now is that you can actually make out the words, even though they're kind of fuzzy.
The proof that you are seeking is not available in books.
The proof that you are seeking is not available in books.
Shipbuilding is a most fascinating process.
Shipbuilding is a most fascinating process.
So we're really excited in terms of achieving that milestone, yet there's still a lot more to do to make it better.
That's fascinating work, Eddie. Michael Cahanna, let's turn to you. There's not a person among us who wouldn't love the prospect that we hear in sci-fi scenarios of one day being able to enhance our memories through some kind of medical intervention. And I know that you have begun work in that direction. So just to get us going, how well do we understand the process, the biological process by which memories are formed in the brain?
Well, I would say that we still are at a very, very early primitive stage in our understanding of the biological processes of the formation of memories, but we do have a very good ability to decode neural signals that predict whether or not memories will be stored and whether or not they will be accurately retrieved.
So you're treating the memory imprinting process as a kind of a black box, I guess, and saying, we don't really understand how it's happening in the brain, but we're just going to observe it and find the patterns. Do you feel that ultimately you're going to need to understand the process itself that's happening inside of our brains, or can we just treat it like that black box?
Well, I think that you need to proceed on multiple tracks. If you want to address the 1 in 12 Americans, for example, who have significant memory loss, then you want to move forward before you wait to have a full understanding or even a good approximate understanding of the underlying processes governing the storage and retrieval of memories. But I think that the most interesting process in the brain is the process by which we retrieve memories rather than the process by which we store memories, because memory retrieval, you might have a memory that's stored really well. I mean, you've experienced this thing many times, and you clearly, this memory pops into mind often, and then you find yourself in a situation where you need that information, you just can't find it, right? So something is going on, the memory is there. And if you just think about the fact that we walk around with vast stores of knowledge, of experience, of memories in our mind, and yet at any given moment, our ability to access that information is really quite limited. It makes you really wonder about the process of memory search. How do we search our memories? How do we retrieve them? And we can't just look at we can't go through the library and look at every index card. We need a mechanism by which to find those memories.
So tell us about the work that you've done in that regard, in trying to understand that in more detail, and also, I gather, in trying to develop approaches that might enhance the ability of an individual to retrieve those memories.
Well, so I think most of us wonder, why is one person's memory good and another person's memory is bad? Why can't I remember things the way I used to when I was much younger? But there is a fascinating paradox or mystery about memory, which is that within a given person, at a given time, let's say today, my memory is going to fluctuate between periods of better and worse function. There will be a dynamic process by which my memory varies in my ability to access those memories that I know, in my ability to create new memories. And we can prove with detailed experimental studies that that variability is not due to some unexplained external experimental factors, but it's something in the brain. It's something in my head that makes memory good at times and not good at other times. So now, if you can decode that physiologically, if you can use electrodes to measure electrical signals, the brain is, after all, an electrical network. If you can measure those electrical signals and forecast when you're going to have a memory lapse, using the electrical signals recorded from the brain, then the idea would be that maybe you could make the brain look more like its best when it is at its worst. And so the idea is that if you first can decode or forecast this complex system that's varying, and then you can pinpoint the moments of a memory lapse and somehow coax or nudge the system from this worse state to this better state. The better state is a state that we know the brain can express. Then perhaps you could meaningfully improve memory. And that's the kind of therapeutic approach that my team is taking.
And so are you working with human subjects and subjecting them to various memory tests and seeing when they're doing well and when they're not, and recording what's happening inside their head and building up the correlation in that way? Is that the approach?
That's exactly right. We have a patient who is undergoing the same kind of neurosurgical evaluation as what Dr. Eddie Chang described. We'll play, instead of playing games where they speak or listen to speech, they're going to play memory games in my work. And we'll track moments of good memory and moments of poor memory. And then we'll try to see whether we can build a mathematical model so that tomorrow, when we come back to the patient's bedside and they play the game, we can predict when their memory is going to be good and when it's not, moment to moment. And now, if that mathematical model is providing a reasonably accurate forecast prediction, we can now use very gentle electrical stimulation of the brain to try to coax the brain into a better memory state. And so what we do is we track those fluctuations in memory in real time. So we determine at any moment whether you're about to forget something or whether you're going to have trouble remembering something. And then we apply electrical stimulation at the moment when memory is predicted to fail, aligned with the kind of stimulation that would generally push it in the direction of a better forecast of good memory. And in that way, you can significantly improve memory in many patients.
How significant?
Well, it's variable from person to person. If you asked how significant in terms of percent memory improvement, it's about 19% improvement. In different studies, between 15 and 20%. In our latest work, 19.2%. If you ask, what does it mean for your memory to be 19.2% better? Like, what does that number mean, 19.2%? That is about half, a little bit more than half, of the deficit that would be incurred in a patient who had a moderate to severe traumatic brain injury. So in other words, that would be on average restoring half of the loss in memory in such a patient. And really what that means is that for, let's say, a third of the patients, it would be almost fully restoring that loss. For a third, it doesn't do anything. And for a third, it's about a half restoration of that loss of memory.
Fascinating. Let me move from that to Michael Halassa, who, Michael, you've been focusing, right? You've been focusing on trying to understand what it is to have attention and whether, for instance, another metaphor that we've certainly all used, which is kind of this spotlight of attention. You know, that's the thing that the brain is illuminating. You know, that's the thing that we're focused on. What have you learned? Is that a good metaphor for thinking about the things that hold our attention, or is there another view of awareness and attention that's emerged from your research?
So, Brian, I'm going to take a roundabout way to answer your question, having followed, Eddie and Michael Cahanna in what they talked about. So, they talked about action, from Eddie's perspective, articulation, moving, and memory. And I think there is a case to be made that one of the primary purposes of having a brain is to plan our next action, right? Without the ability to move and act on the world, it makes no sense to have a brain in the first place. That's why plants don't have a brain. And, as you go up in evolution, organisms that are better able to plan the sequences of their actions have bigger brains, have bigger internal models of how they control those actions over prolonged periods of time, and there's a temporal hierarchy there, and ultimately they have a pretty good way of using these stored patterns of past inputs that we call memory, right? And my work has been on this sort of intermediate level of organization between, temporally speaking, between action, immediate action, and long-term memory, which is this idea of cognitive control. One of the aspects by which we control our cognition is through attention. How we prioritize incoming sensory information, how we filter them, and then how we sort of format them in a way that would be appropriate for both short-term and long-term action planning.
So we talk about making models of the world, which is vital, right? Because, look, we're inundated by information all the time. I mean, right now I'm just sitting here in this theater, and the electromagnetic waves that are impinging on my eye, you've got these oscillating electric fields and magnetic fields trillions of times a second. If I was sensitive to even that information at that level of description, my brain would be overwhelmed, right, to trying to cope with that data. So what does the brain do to cope with this influx of information?
So I think that's a fascinating question. And I think it's helpful to, coming from MIT, I think it's helpful to invoke David Marr. Marr stipulated that we can think of the brain as we can think of a computer as, and I'm not saying the brain is a computer, I'm just saying this is a helpful metaphor for approximating the types of things that we do as neuroscientists to understand the brain. There's a computational level, the high-level objective that we're trying to accomplish for any particular neural process. The algorithmic level, which is what are the series of steps that the brain could take in order to sort of perform this computation. And then the implementational level, how is this actually implemented in neural hardware, in spiking neurons? Right? And for any particular neural operation, I think thinking about things in this particular way, in that sort of division, is helpful. And understanding ultimately may be how we link these different levels of description to one another, where it becomes natural to talk about, the algorithms of the mind implemented in neural hardware of spiking neurons. The work that we've, done in my lab has focused on the implementation to the algorithmic level. So we record from individual spiking neurons in the brain in areas like the prefrontal cortex, this front part of the brain. And that's where we think a lot of cognitive control operations are generated. And the way by which we imagine they control things like what memory should we retrieve or what things should we pay attention to is by sending what we call these top-down instructions to downstream neural circuits to change their operation in such a way that we dampen the noise on the things that we don't care about, we amplify the signals on the things that we care about, and we retrieve the memories that we currently are looking for, we upload the memories that we care about, and so on.
Is it accurate to say that the brain then, from a hardware perspective, and perhaps an algorithmic perspective too, has kind of gatekeepers, that information is trying to make it up to the place of attention and awareness, but those gatekeepers are only letting some things through? Is that a reasonable way of thinking about it?
That's a great analogy. And I would say that it's not just in the domain of sensory systems. I would say that this is in the domain of cognition as well. I think that even, I'm going to make, sort of a conjecture here, that even when we are trying to retrieve, generative hypotheses about what's going on in the world, I would say most people would be going through this filtering process in order to sort of maximize the likelihood of what's out there, right? I mean, these are statistical inference machinery that we have in our brain to infer what's going on in the outside world. And we have these things automatically running in the background all the time to arrive at the world as we see it out there. I think in certain disorders, for example, like psychosis, schizophrenia, etc., these kinds of inferential filtering mechanisms at the level of cognition are impaired. And that's why we end up seeing, again, this is my sort of leading hypothesis of what's going on in some of these illnesses, is that these filtering operations in that domain are impaired. And you end up with folks, and concluding that the FBI is after them, aliens are landing in their backyard, etc.
Fascinating. So Helen, we've seen a lot of discussion to this point regarding patterns in the brain that give us insight into words and speech in Eddie Chang's work, insight into memory retrieval, Michael Cahanna's work, issues of attention and awareness, gatekeeper aspects of the brain in Michael Halassa's work. Your work is also, as I understand it, focused upon patterns in the brain, but your focus has been on the patterns that correspond to depression. So can you give us a sense of what that work has revealed? Is there a kind of uniform mental brain pattern that one can associate with that kind of an affective disorder?
So I think it's important first to kind of define the term. I mean, depression is really a very common and serious medical illness. And I'll make the argument that it's a brain illness. We can put people in scanners and we can get maps of what is the topography, the functional topography of brain areas that are abnormal. And it turns out there's not just one spot, none of these complex systems, but even in these syndromes, if you have problems with mood and drive and thoughts and actions, it's no big surprise that you see multiple brain areas acting together or actually not acting together that are abnormal, and those can be mapped. And one can subsequently map how the dynamics of the brain changes with treatments. And our work on decoding, so to speak, or actually our use of causal manipulations in the brain, not just with medication or therapy, but in real time with electrodes, helps us to see that you can go from no capacity at all to within seconds, minutes, have a total shift of actually how you can see the outside world when you are stuck internalized.
Can you tell us a little bit more about exactly that? So if you have a patient who is depressed, clinically diagnosed as depressed, presumably the patterns of the brain are sufficiently recognizable that simply by looking at that data, you would recognize that that would be the appropriate diagnosis. Can you go that far in lining them up?
Well, I think that, we like to think so, that we work in groups of patients. Our team has taken the approach of diagnose depression by standard of practice, throw people in a scanner, take a resting state, picture of the brain, treat people with different kinds of treatments for 3 months. You're either well or you're not. Go back to the beginning and see if you can tell the difference of how people responded. It's working now that you can start to look at an individual patient to make a decision about which way to treat. And we and others are trying to look at that kind of treatment-specific biomarker, but it's the same network in the brain, but in different states. So the question is every patient different? Or is there one pattern? There's not one pattern because we don't know what the instigator is of depression. And by the time a patient is ill, there are many maladaptive patterns that you're seeing. And so you're really trying to wade through all of this noise to get at the kernel that might be helpful. And at that point, as György said, the self-organizing system is totally self-organized to try to adapt. And now you actually have to figure out what is the state you're in. You're now lost. So how do you take someone lost and figure out what you can do to move them back into a place where they can retrain and be found? And that's really, it's become much more clear in our work with implants what that really means. That was harder to see when people were less sick.
So with the implants, and you mentioned this really stunning result of in minutes, you mentioned sometimes you can see a change in a person. Can you just tell us a little bit about that? How were you stimulating that person? Was it through some kind of electrode in the brain? And what was the response like in some of these remarkable cases?
So, there have been many now. So I started this 15 years ago in Toronto with a team, a neurosurgery team, Anders Lozano, Sid Kennedy, a psychiatrist. We basically took the hypothesis based on this imaging, on this map that we had that really told us there were brain areas that were working together, but their synchrony was dysregulated. And we basically had reason to believe that one area deep in the brain seemed to be the ringleader. It was really focused, the subcallosal cingulate. It's connections to midline thalamus, like Michael talks about. It's connections to the hippocampus that Mike Cahanna talks about. It's connections to the frontal cortex, to the hypothalamus, to other parts of the brainstem. It seemed to be focused in a place that if it didn't change, it wreaked havoc on everything else. We didn't take epilepsy patients. We took depressed people who had failed multiple drugs, psychotherapy, electroconvulsive shock therapy. They're pretty much at the end of the line. They were in that attractor state. They are stuck and they can't get out. And we basically said, can we leverage the technology that's used in Parkinson's, implant with anatomical precision in this area and in the white matter that connects it to these other areas in this putative circuit. And actually, when we stimulate at high frequency, it's like we release the lockdown of this region and people kind of come out of it. So as we got better and better at it with our imaging, we can plan the surgery precisely within millimeters, place it at this convergence of these multiple pathways that we know interact with each other. And we know that from animal studies, we know that from epilepsy studies. And when we apply the high frequency stimulation, we can predict that someone will emerge. And what they describe is that the negative turns off, and it's as though they kind of come back online. They can pay attention, they feel connected, they feel like they can move. So the paralysis kind of goes away, and that happens very rapidly. And if you give the stimulation, even in the operating room, 10, 15 minutes so that we can record and actually see what happens, we leave the operating room and they'll stay well, several weeks without further stim. And then we actually turn it on and give stimulation. And we have patients that have these chronic implants, have this pacemaker on all the time, and people are better and go about their business, so that we've reset something very fast, and then we've allowed the brain, again, I'll use this self-organizing principle, to relearn who you are with a brain that doesn't get stuck.
Yeah, that's remarkable, Helen, that a little electrical nudge at the right spot in the brain can have such a dramatic long-term effect. Now, Michael Cahanna, you've also found that the right electrical nudge can have a big impact, elevating the capacity of patients to retrieve memories. So, Michael, when you add these tiny little electrical impulses to the brain, I'm assuming the patient doesn't feel it. They only
No, they
feel
don't feel
the
anything.
repercussions of that stimulation. So this is truly, you are manipulating the brain. The patient doesn't know when you're doing it, but yet they will show a difference on these memory exams that shows a marked difference from before and after.
What we do is we apply these stimulation protocols randomly on certain lists. There's certain memory games. The game might be like 30 seconds or a minute trial with or without. The patient doesn't know, the experimenter doesn't know, and that's how we gauge the beneficial effects.
And so do you think that the ability to read these signals and even to manipulate these signals, which is what you're doing now, will this ultimately lead to a full understanding of the process of memory retrieval? And I would love to memory formation as well. Is this the route toward that goal?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really critical question that we want to know the answer to, meaning if you have people, let's assume that we can create a therapy whose benefit is sufficiently meaningful that many people who need the therapy will get the therapy. And the risk is low and the benefit is high. And now you have people walking around with devices that decode variable memory states in the brain and transmit those signals encrypted to a cloud, which is able to analyze those signals and build up a massive database of information about how the brain operates when you're studying and recalling information, or even just doing your regular activities of daily life. Once you have that massive database, you could imagine that you could begin to test theories out and improve and refine theories, much like, maybe the Hubble telescope or some other devices give you insights into the cosmos. This kind of technology could give us tremendous insights into an understanding of memory encoding and memory retrieval.
Eddie, the technology you've developed synthesizes speech based on the intention to form words. Have you applied this in situations when the individual is speech impaired for some reason? Has it been able to work in those circumstances?
Right. Well, that's a great question. So for the past 10 years, we've really focused on what that basic science, that basic neuroscience of this code for all of the different consonants and vowels and movements of the vocal tract to give rise to speech. And about 2 years ago, because of the results of that foundational work, we started a clinical trial, actually called the Bravo trial, in which we enrolled the first participant. It was a young gentleman who, at the time when he enrolled in the study, was 35 years old. And the reason he was a participant in this study was that 15 years ago, he was in a car accident that led to complications of a brainstem stroke, with the inability to move his arms and legs, as well as to speak. And so for us, that was a very important development in the last 2 years, to move a lot of what we had studied in the context of people who are normally speaking to a clinical context in the situation of someone who is fully paralyzed, who has the full capacity and intent to speak in the cerebral cortex, but couldn't because of a disconnection in the brainstem. And we were able to translate that brain activity into full words. The proof of principle is there in that it is possible to really leverage that rich information of those patterns of neural activity to give rise to things that are so human and so intimate, like words and speech.
That's fascinating work. Michael Halassa, unlike Eddie and Helen and Mike Cahanna, I understand that you work primarily with animals rather than with humans. So how do you go about that?
So we train them on decision-making tasks in which they need to retrieve a reward. It's what we call alternative choice tasks. So we do it trial by trial. So on every trial, we give the animal the option of choosing between two options. and the animal is required to do this based on appropriately deploying attention. So on every trial, for example, it gets a visual or an auditory target, and it has to pick the appropriate one. We train it to be sensitive to a cue beforehand. So we cue it on every trial, and we can make that cue sort of ambiguous. So basically, we can make this process of attention a decision-making process. Decide what to pay attention to based on ambiguous input. And that allows us to study how the brain decides to what to pay attention to, and both the filtering at the level of the cognitive operation and the filtering at the level of the sensory operation.
And those animals, typically, is that mice or dogs or cats?
A lot of the work that we have published so far are in mice, and the reason why we choose mice is because they are they're mechanistically tractable. We can go in and turn circuits on and off using a technology called optogenetics, and we can talk about that later. And then in more recent studies, we've been using this organism called the tree shrew, Tupaya, and that's an organism that's sort of intermediate between rodents and primates, and that allows us the same kind of mechanistic accessibility, but we can achieve high-level cognition and study things like causal inference in these animals.
If schizophrenia, for instance, aligns with the theoretical description that you're imagining, somehow the gatekeeper not doing its work, does that suggest a particular treatment or course of action, or is it too early for that kind of a diagnostic?
I can tell you where my intuition comes from. So my intuition comes from studying a particular circuit from the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, which is particularly developed in humans, and its connection to a structure called the mediodorsal thalamus, the part of the thalamus or a central structure in the brain. In schizophrenia patients, those connections, the structural integrity of these connections are impaired, and that's been known for a long time. In my lab and others in the community, we've been studying this particular network in animals. And what we've been finding is that a lot of these cognitive filtering operations, sort of deciding which evidence you should use in order to deploy your attention, goes through those circuits. Almost the algorithm is going through different refresh cycles between these two structures. And in that, process, the thalamus really acts as a filter for how reliable the information that you're getting is. So the idea that patients and animals, when we impair those structures, when we inhibit those connections, end up jumping to unlikely conclusions, basically leads us to conclude that this is a reasonable hypothesis to have about these impaired inferential mechanisms in schizophrenia.
György, so we've heard from a lot of researchers, the 4 researchers on the discussion here tonight. Eddie talking about looking at the brain, finding the patterns that decodes to language, the Michaels on memory and attention, Helen on other patterns that allow us to understand aspects of depression and even have suggested ways to address that situation that have been remarkably effective. All of that, I believe you would describe as the outside-in approach to understanding the brain. We as third-party observers, we objective scientists are studying some aspect of patterns inside the brain, and with that third-party perspective, trying to do something to the brain in order to get the pattern to change or to read the pattern or to do something with the pattern. I gather your view is that, yes, this is profound work, but I think that you suggest that there's another way of thinking about it that ultimately you think is the way forward. Give us a sense of what that is.
And historically, research in the brain or on the brain has been working its way in from the outside world, hoping that such systematic approach will take us to the middle and on through the middle to the output, which is the action. Now, of course, people didn't start out as neuroscientists. Early thinkers were thinking about the importance of psyche, the soul, the mind, and so on. And they were speculating. And that speculation was codified by Christian philosophers and then the British empiricists. The bottom line of all of this is that the brains, the human brains, are there to learn the truth of the world that is outside in its entity and its beauty. And in the process, we realized that we need to explain various things. And so we made up terms such as attention, memory, decision-making, creativity, imagination, scratch pad memory, working memory, and I can go on and on and on and on. There are many, many, many words. So when neuroscience entered the scene, it seemed that we already have a task. We are on the right road. We have a roadmap, what we have to do, namely to find homes to all of these terms and see how they work. I think you agree with me that this is a naive approach, because those boundaries that we made up in our minds and those boundaries that smart people 1,000 years ago, hundreds of years ago, they made up as a term, cannot really have a mechanism with the same boundaries inside the brain. Now, just to give you an example, this is this outside-in approach is also used to be called the tabula rasa or the blank slate model and so on, with the understanding that you just have to shovel knowledge into the brain because the brain is a receiver that is there ready to absorb all the information that comes from outside. So, for example, when we inspect an elephant, which has a shape, size, smell, and so on, then the goal is to figure out how the brain combines or binds those attributes into a representation or into a symbol, and it becomes a symbol of the elephant. There is a fundamental problem with this approach, which is the attributes of the elephant, or of any object for that sake, is not in the object. Those attributes are made by the brain. So that's where we are right now. We are at what I can call a blind alley, and we are trying to find our way out from this blind alley.
So what do you think is the way out? I mean, I'm not sure that everybody would agree, so I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but if one agrees that this is a blind alley, what do you think is the way forward? What are we missing? Is it a radical change of perspective? Do you just need to add something to the mix in order to have a more complete framework?
Well, an alternative, what I call the brain-centric view, the one I'm promoting, is that we learn from our actions. The task of the brain, if there is a task, evolutionary task, is to serve the body and the consequences, predict the consequences of our actions. Now, let me explain the difference between the two frameworks in practical neuroscience terms. So what we have been doing for decades is that we present something to the brain, be it an experimental animal or a human brain, and we record from inside the brain, and it could be an electrical pulse that we are picking up in Michael Cahanna's lab, or it could be a bolt signal that imagers get. And then we correlate the two, and then we say, oh, wow, there's a nice correlation between a moving pattern and the neurons firing a particular way in the visual cortex, for example. We can go further on, and Eddie showed a very nice example that we can train a computational algorithm and say, we make these systems smart. It's so smart that now we can reverse the process. We are recording from brain activity, and from the previous learning, we can reconstruct what would be, for example, the music, what would be the language from the brain patterns. There is a catch here. The catch is that the experimenter is in a privileged situation. Only the experimenter has access to the world outside there and the activity of the brain inside here. Neurons in the brain have no clue what's going on in the outside world. Neurons will just get action potentials from their partners, and they have no clue whether those action potentials mean anything outside. In other words, this approach does have no grounding. As I mentioned, grounding is a process where the unknown is ground it to the known. And there is only one source of knowledge that neurons can have besides what's coming in from the outside world, and this is action or output. Now, action, of course, is a typical way you think you are moving your arms or you moving your eyes or do something like that. But action is also the action on your heart, the action on your endocrine system, and thought is also an action. Now, the good news is that every action system in the brain informs, it sends out an output not only to the body, but it also informs the rest of the brain that I have sent out an output. Now, neurons in the visual cortex, for example, can deal with two types of information. One is that is coming from outside, the one is coming from here. So this is the way, and the only way how I can say that I am the actor, I am the agent of my own actions. So this is a fundamental difference between the two approaches. And I would say, let me give you an example. No amount of stirring a stick in water, or no amount of argument between you and me, we would agree that the stick is broken or not. But a little movement, a little action there, immediately will reveal to the brain that the stick is not broken. The source of knowledge in the traditional outside-in model is the assumed richness of the world, waiting to be observed by a camera-like brain. In contrast, in the inside-out framework, knowledge comes from action-based exploration, and everything is compared and valued from the organism's point of view. No exploration, no knowledge.
So I gather, and apologies if this is a coarse summary, but you want to kind of close the loop where the brain does receive stimuli from the external world, but it also acts on the external world, which then affects the stimuli we receive from the external world, and it's this loop of information that is required for the brain to have grounding, for it to know that there's an external world, to know what these neural firings are actually corresponding to in the external sense. But what is the definition of action? And I ask for the following reason. So, as you noted, action in the most straightforward is just moving the arms and the legs and so forth. But you also mentioned it can be the action of one neuron sending an outward signal within the brain itself. So can action be a completely inner process, or does it need to access the external world?
It doesn't have to need to have any access to the external world. I'll give you an example. When you are born, before you are born, we all kick. Baby kicks are very, very important. And the baby kicks correlate with the Apgar score and the intelligence quotient 20 years later and so on. So they are very important. What they do is help the brain to build a body map. And it's a very fascinating mechanism, namely that every single time there is this dumb teacher that some muscle activity is there, it sends back a signal to the future sensory, somatosensory representation. Now, of course, this is not a random process because the skeletal system confines how those muscles can move. So now the agonist and the antagonist are represented together in time when I happen to move my left arm or I happen to move my finger as a baby or as a fetus. And those timing effects, because their proximity in time, they allow that neurons, when they grow in, they will make the connections appropriately. So this is how we make a map of the body, and we build it up and update it every day, because every week the distance between your finger and your nose it varies, so it has to be updated. So this is an example of how an action system can teach and make sensation meaningful. No amount of sensation. You can have your camera, your eyes, everything, or you can give any amount of information through sensors to a robot. That robot just remains dumb. Without testing the distance between me and the tree and between me and the mountain, I have no clue whether the mountain is bigger or smaller than the tree. So only through this action-based calibration can sensation make sense.
So I just want to comment on that because, again, it's observation from the patients. But despite the fact that I described this shift from a total internal focus in these depressed patients to the capacity to interact outside themselves and to get the feedback. And what we see over time is exactly what György is talking about. It takes time to recalibrate one's own internal body and its relationship to the outside world. And you're watching over months. We actually saw a patient for a 10-year follow-up last week who, when she tried to describe in retrospect every stage of recovery, she was realizing that updating her own external internal map had been an ongoing process. And that when she tried to identify, yeah, she remembered in the operating room, but that was minor compared to actually taking a year or two to really trust her representation of her internal state, the outside world, and to feel that there was dynamical predictions that she could make and learn. And so I'm a fan of how György is conceptualizing it, even if at the neuron to neuron level, we have no idea, but the metaphors that patients use, the experience that they have, is there is no depression per se. It's just the absence of capacity to do those ongoing updates that probably is how we should really look at what we see.
So let me jump off from that to one final question as we're running out of time here. I want to go back to Eddie Chang, and a question that I'll ask Eddie, but one that I'd like you all to weigh in on if you have a perspective on it. Eddie, you noted that you go into the operating room and you look at the brain itself, and you know that it's more than a computer, right? You're not looking at a motherboard with chips. It's something beyond a computer. But from your years of staring at the brain and manipulating the brain and trying to decode the brain, where do you come down on the question that, of course, has been kicked around for hundreds, if not thousands of years? Is consciousness, right? We really haven't spoken about consciousness here, and some of you may roll your eyes at the idea of consciousness, and if that's your response, I'd be happy to hear it. But when it comes to consciousness, is it within this physical structure? Is that all that there is? Or do you find that it's even inadequate for that purpose, that you think there has to be something beyond the physical in order for us to have the kinds of inner worlds that happen inside of our heads?
Yeah, Brian, thanks for asking that question. And from a physician's perspective, we think about consciousness in fairly concrete terms in terms of whether someone is awake or not awake. There's some very, very important medical definitions that we use to define consciousness, and there are specific parts of the brain. For example, the brainstem and the thalamus, the areas that Michael Halassa studies very intensely, and how they interact with the cortex, that need to be intact in order to have conscious awareness. There's a lot of other aspects of conscious awareness and subjective perception and our appreciation of the environment and that kind of awareness. But in terms of the basic fundamental idea of being awake versus asleep, from my understanding, the way I see it is that it's an emergent property that results from the interactions of some very, very core structures in the brain, including the thalamus and other subcortical areas. You can see that when people have brain injuries in some of these areas, they may never fully wake up from those strokes or traumatic brain injuries, where in other parts of the brain, there's no effect whatsoever, even that you can detect in many cases. So the location, the substrate, the hardware is very fundamental to this. The operation, the implementation of how the neurons in these particular brain locations give rise to conscious awareness is a fascinating question that a lot of people are working on now, and it's very much related to all of our work.
Michael Halassa, how about your views? Consciousness purely physical, something else? Will a computer ever be able to have the kind of inner worlds that we do?
I mean, I think it's a great question, Brian. I think you mean, by consciousness, you mean phenomenal consciousness, the experience of...
I mean, the thing that's happening right between my ears right now.
Yeah, what it is to be me, what is it to have a perspective, what is it to have, the redness of red, the qualitative experience of the outside world. I mean, I think we're missing something really fundamental in our description of science altogether, to be able to arrive at an answer to the question, will a computer have consciousness or not? Does an ant have a consciousness? Does anybody else other than me have consciousness? I think, we just don't know. I mean, we don't really have the theoretical framework to be able to answer a question of this nature. I mean, I'd like to think that, other people other than me do have an internal experience and do see green and red in ways that are similar to me. And by extension, I can imagine dogs and cats doing the same thing. And I do believe fundamentally that the brain is generating processes that can be approximated in artificial in machines, and therefore I don't see a reason why machines won't be able to experience things that are similar to that. But again, I can't tell you how.
Yeah. Helen, any thoughts on the physical basis of conscious awareness versus something else?
The short answer is no. And I think, these are surrogate discussions, and when we have a readout, I'm not even sure that we would know that we know that that's what we're talking about. But I'll leave that to philosophers and neuroscientists that think they're studying it.
György?
The dream that we dream together is reality. So that's a nice metaphor, and we can go this way. But you ask the concrete questions, whether my consciousness, that is Brian's consciousness, has something to do with your brain and only with the brain. My answer is definitely no. And this is a connection between the computer and your brain. And your eyes are rolling now, I can see. Your brain is calibrated not by the physical world only, but also by my brain and brains of many, 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 many others. So this reflection of your actions back to you or back to the brain is what gives rise to something that we are talking about. And of course, you can ask also whether computers can have it. Well, right now what we do is all that information that give to the computers, usually there is one. Computers don't, or robots don't communicate with each other. So it is an unfair comparison between, a few billion people's knowledge compared to one or few machines that thousands and thousands of people put together. The competition, or the real thing, would be that we have at least 1 million robots running around in the world, and they would team up against us, and then would they collaborate and things like that. That's where we would talk about the funny part, whether we could be outsmarted or not.
Right. Michael, Cahanna, I'm giving you the last word. Consciousness. Anything you want to share on your thoughts?
I think that the most interesting things that the brain does are the things that it's not consciously aware of. It's all that stuff behind the veil of consciousness that is working in the background, and that may underlie, for example, why somebody might ultimately become depressed, right? Or why their memories of events that happened long ago are doing stuff to affect their future behavior. They're not even aware of it. I think we want to understand all of that stuff, the inside stuff that sometimes doesn't come out immediately, but may come out at an inopportune moment. I'd really like to understand those processes.
Well, I just like to reiterate what Michael Cahanna said, and several of you, that what is me? Me is my memories. If you take away my memories, am I aware of my surroundings? God knows, it's kind of you are a zombie. You can react, and it's hard to tell whether you are the same Brian than 5 minutes ago. But without your past, you cannot have that kind of consciousness that philosophers are talking about.
Yeah, no, I mean, the fact that collections of particles can hold on to a lifetime of memories, as we were talking before, giving us a consistent identity through time, is of course the essence of what it means to be human. So from this human being to you 5 human beings, from these brain patterns to yours, I thank you so much for this conversation on the brain. It was deeply fascinating and illuminating. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.